LaMarcus Aldridge will not return to the Portland Trail Blazers this upcoming offseason. But before we get into the reasons why, make sure to subscribe to our brand new live streaming channel. The link is in the description below. Right now we're streaming Mondays and Fridays around 3:30 to 4:30 p.m. When the season gets back underway, presumably in July, we will be back to streaming Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays, and we will be back to doing post-game live streams. Also, if you want to help me out, there is a tip jar link down in the description below, and there's also a link to some Blazers Uprise merch, so if you want that, check it out. Now, there's a lot of talk about LaMarcus Aldridge returning to the Portland Trail Blazers and finishing his career off where it started. After everything that went down with him leaving the Blazers to go to the San Antonio Spurs, it would be a storybook ending for him to redeem himself, and do so by bringing Portland its second championship in franchise history by reuniting with his old sidekick Damian Lillard. But the thing is, this final chapter, if it ever does happen, will not start this summer. And there are three main reasons why LaMarcus Aldridge won't return to the Portland Trail Blazers this upcoming offseason. Now, normally I'd say this summer for an upcoming offseason, but as we all know, this schedule is really messed up, so the offseason is probably going to be in fall. So it does sound weird to just say this upcoming offseason, but that's kind of what I gotta say right now because everything's in flux. But what's not in flux is the situation that the Portland Trail Blazers will find themselves in whenever the offseason does happen. But the very first reason why LaMarcus Aldridge will not return to the Portland Trail Blazers this upcoming offseason is actually because of what has led up to that offseason. Simply put, I have a hard time seeing the San Antonio Spurs or the Portland Trail Blazers changing their mind on a potential LaMarcus Aldridge trade this offseason when they didn't make it happen during the trade deadline. Now, there wasn't any actual buzz about the Portland Trail Blazers making a move for LaMarcus Aldridge, and that could have been for two reasons. The first reason would be the San Antonio Spurs wanted too much, or they didn't want to trade Aldridge at all. The second reason could be the Portland Trail Blazers really weren't interested in Aldridge no matter what the asking price was. Now, looking at this from the Blazers' point of view first, it makes no sense why they wouldn't go after Aldridge at the trade deadline and then they'd try to go after him this summer. The main reason why that doesn't make sense is actually another one of these three reasons, and that is that the Portland Trail Blazers don't really have the means to make an Aldridge acquisition happen this summer. So therefore, if Portland wanted LaMarcus Aldridge, then the trade deadline was the perfect time to do it. He could have slotted into Whiteside's role as the starting center, bridging the gap until Nurkic returned, and then Aldridge would have been a better fit next to Nurkic than Whiteside. But the second, and probably most likely reason why trade didn't happen was the San Antonio Spurs weren't really looking to move off LaMarcus Aldridge. But the thing is, if the Spurs were not looking to trade Aldridge or wanted too much at the trade deadline last year, I have a hard time seeing that change this offseason. This 2019-2020 season for the San Antonio Spurs has been their worst season in over 2 decades. At the deadline, this season was already looking like a lost cause in a season that they couldn't really compete in. And given the fact that the Spurs probably could have gotten more for LaMarcus Aldridge at the deadline compared to trying to trade him this summer, it makes no sense why they would hold on to LaMarcus Aldridge at the deadline for what was most likely going to be a lottery appearance and then try and flip him this summer. Now, of course, organizations can change direction at any time. Sometimes they go completely against the moves that they made up to that point. Sometimes their changes of direction can seem somewhat random. So the Spurs might elect to blow it up this summer. Maybe DeMar DeRozan declines his player option and leaves on free agency, and at that point, the Spurs decide to trade Aldridge. This isn't a 100% reason for LaMarcus Aldridge not returning this summer, but when you combine this with the other two reasons I'm about to list, it leads me to the conclusion that it's not happening. So jumping into reason number 2, the Portland Trail Blazers do not have the means to make this move happen. Now, Portland has to trade out around $19 million in order to bring LaMarcus Aldridge back via trade. Now, they could hypothetically send out this $19 million or so in two different ways. One would be trading players that are already under contract on the roster. Now, assuming Olshey doesn't lose his mind and trade Lillard, McCollum, or Nurkic out for Aldridge, then the Trail Blazers would certainly have to trade out Trevor Ariza. That would count as $12.8 million of upcoming salary, so you'd also have to attach another $6.2 million of salary or so. The thing is, there isn't another player on the roster making that sort of money. The guy who gets closest is Rodney Hood, who has a player option for $6 million going into next season. If Hood declines that option, the Blazers can't trade him. He'd be a free agent. If he accepts that option, then yes, you could hypothetically attach Ariza with Rodney Hood with another player, who knows who that would be. But in that scenario, it really makes no sense for the Portland Trail Blazers to trade both their small forwards for LaMarcus Aldridge. That would be a tragic trade, and that trade makes no sense, especially if Hassan Whiteside stays. If Whiteside left and Olshey decided to make that trade happen, then the Blazers wouldn't have a legitimate small forward on the roster that's ready to play minutes for a contending team. That hole would be much larger than the hole that LaMarcus Aldridge would fill. And even then, that trade package would be contingent upon Rodney Hood accepting his player option, and then we'd also have to attach another player to Ariza and Hood. It just doesn't make any sense. The other way we could make it happen, which has been discussed too much, is through a sign and trade by sending out Hassan Whiteside to the San Antonio Spurs. Now, the narrative I've seen that's just completely wrong on this whole thing is that we could get Hassan Whiteside to accept something like a $20 million contract with the San Antonio Spurs, and we could get the San Antonio Spurs to agree to that as well. And then we could orchestrate a LaMarcus Aldridge trade by sign and trading Whiteside to San Antonio. But there's a few problems with this. One, I've never ever heard of a sign and trade ever working that way. I'm not even sure it's allowed under the rules. But the main reason is, why the hell would the San Antonio Spurs trade LaMarcus Aldridge, which would be the start of a rebuild, and want to pay Hassan Whiteside $20 million? Hassan Whiteside's going to be 32 years old next season. He's probably slightly declining, and he's not going to be a part of their future long term. He would just take away minutes from young developing players. Side note, I actually really like Jakob Poeltl. I think he's a really underrated center. He's a guy who can pass a little bit, can rebound, can protect the rim, and can finish well inside. Honestly, Whiteside's better, but not by much, and Poeltl is a lot younger. Why would the San Antonio Spurs bring in Hassan Whiteside for $20 million a year just to take away minutes from Poeltl, and possibly take away minutes from another young center that they could potentially get this offseason? You know, maybe they draft James Wiseman, maybe they draft a Kongwu. It just makes no sense whatsoever that the San Antonio Spurs would want Hassan Whiteside, especially considering this fact that a lot of people overlook. If you sign and trade a player, they have to agree to a 3-year contract at the bare minimum. Now, you can have that 3rd year guaranteed, but you can't have back-to-back years unguaranteed for a veteran free agent. So that would be around $20 million a year, not just for 1 year, for 2 years. There's no way the San Antonio Spurs would want to give Hassan Whiteside that amount of guaranteed money unless we were trading something like the 1st overall pick and Anthony Simons and Zach Collins, or some just ridiculous package of assets. But at that point, that makes no sense for the Portland Trail Blazers to give up that much value for LaMarcus Aldridge. This is the strongest point on this list. This is the main reason why this won't happen. The Blazers just simply don't have the tools that they need to make a LaMarcus Aldridge trade, unless they trade out both their small forwards, which at that point, I will literally crucify Olshey if that happens. Thing is, Olshey isn't that dumb. It's not going to happen. And the third and final reason might surprise some people, but some others will see this one coming. LaMarcus Aldridge's skill set doesn't really make sense on this team. So that segues into a couple different points. One, I think the Blazers could re-sign Hassan Whiteside, who isn't any worse of a backup center option, and in that scenario, the Blazers wouldn't have to give away Ariza and Hood for LaMarcus Aldridge. So the only reason why the Blazers would go after LaMarcus Aldridge would be to start him at power forward and play him 30 to 35 minutes per game. And honestly, if you gave Aldridge a lesser role, he probably wouldn't be happy. So, okay, some fans would say, yeah, you just play him at power forward for 35 minutes per game. That's where he played when he was here before. But the thing is, LaMarcus Aldridge is not a power forward at this point in his career. He is a center. Sure, he can play some power forward, but you don't want him playing many minutes at that position, especially as he ages, and especially given the way the roster is constructed around that. With Dame and CJ not being the best defenders, you need 3 good defenders in the front court in order to have a top 10 defense. And honestly, I think the Blazers would need a top 10 defense in order to truly contend for a championship. If you put LaMarcus Aldridge in that starting lineup with them, that defense has no chance of being above average. That defense would be in the bottom 15. LaMarcus Aldridge is going to be 35 years old next year. His lateral quickness is declining. His ability to close out well on shooters is declining. His ability to cover ground on the defensive end, it's declining. Those things are needed in order to be an effective defender at the power forward position. That's why LaMarcus Aldridge is more of a center at this point in his career, because as guys age, they slow down, and you need more quickness in order to effectively guard power forwards in the modern NBA. So LaMarcus Aldridge is a decent defender at center. He is a bad defender at power forward. You cannot have a bad defender at power forward if you want this team to be an above average defense. I mean, sure, maybe Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum could miraculously turn into Drew Holiday and Lonzo Ball's defenders, but assuming that doesn't happen, if you slot LaMarcus Aldridge in there at power forward, this defense is not going to be good. But not just that, Aldridge's poor fit with this team goes beyond just the defense. I've always said we need 3-and-D forwards starting next to Nurkic, CJ, and Dame. We've already explained why Aldridge's defense wouldn't fit into that, but you can't really rely on him to bring the three-point shot either. Sure, he is shooting 39% from behind the arc this season on 3 attempts per game, but that's only in 53 games, and that's not something that you can really rely on him to maintain because he's never shown that level of three-point shooting at all during his career. The 2 seasons before this one, he shot 24 and 29% respectively. Now, if you look at Aldridge's 13 seasons prior to this one, Aldridge had only 1 season where he attempted more than 1 3 a game and shot over 30%. So relying on him to maintain this level of three-point shooting that he's shown so far this season isn't something that I'm really comfortable with. Sure, he could be adapting his game in the way he needs in order to be effective as he ages, but a 53-game sample size of 3 three-point attempts per game is really nothing when you compare it to his 14-year NBA career. He's played over 1,000 games in his career. 53 games, that's about 5%. If I'm going to put stock in LaMarcus Aldridge as a three-point shooter, I'm going to have a lot more confidence basing it on 95% of his career compared to 5%, even though that 5% is this season. Therefore, you could end up in a situation where the Portland Trailblazers starting power forward is not a good three-point shooter or defender. That just doesn't make sense from a roster construct standpoint. It just doesn't. Dame, CJ, and Nurkic need as much spacing as possible. That's what will help them be most effective. You risk that by having LaMarcus Aldridge out there. Now, I know some people will say, oh, well, LaMarcus Aldridge, he's a good mid-range shooter. He might not be able to space the floor all the way out to the three-point arc, but he can hit deep twos, so he can space the floor out to there. However, my response to that is LaMarcus Aldridge really isn't that efficient from mid-range. I think he's a little bit overrated of a mid-range jump shooter. Looking back over his career, LaMarcus Aldridge has generally been around a 42 to 44% shooter from both 10 to 16 feet and 16 feet to the three-point arc. Yeah, that's not terrible, but I'm going to get a little bit nerdy with you guys with some numbers. For his career, LaMarcus Aldridge is 42% from both 10 to 16 feet and 16 feet to 3. That is 0.84 points per shot. To put that in perspective, that's the equivalent of an offensive rating of 84. That's not good at all. I think defenses would have a decent amount of success letting the Portland Trailblazers offense settle for long Aldridge twos compared to Dame cooking them, or CJ cooking them, or Nurkic working out of the high post distributing, or Nurkic working in the low post, or a Dame Nurkic pick and roll. There are a lot of better actions than settling for LaMarcus Aldridge long twos. So in conclusion for this third and final point, I would rather have a 3-and-D power forward, a guy that you can rely on to shoot 35-36% from the three-point arc and that can defend multiple positions. The thing is, we can go out and get a guy like that with our mid-level exception without having to give up Trevor Ariza and Rodney Hood, or without having to rely on some miracle sign and trade of Whiteside that'll never happen. I think Olshey knows this as well, and therefore Olshey is not planning on pursuing LaMarcus Aldridge because, to summarize things, I don't think he made a push in the first place at the trade deadline. And now Olshey knows he doesn't really have the tools to make an Aldridge trade happen. But even if he did, I don't think Olshey would really be that enamored with bringing LaMarcus Aldridge back because of how poor of a fit he would be as a starting power forward. Now, the offseason after this, in 2021, might make sense for LaMarcus Aldridge to sign for the mid-level exception and return as a backup center, you know. Whiteside might not be here by then. We might have been able to re-sign him this offseason and trade him at the deadline. In that scenario, you could sign Aldridge and he could play backup center. I actually like Aldridge in that role. So this isn't to say that Aldridge will never make his return, just that it won't happen this offseason. So anyway, let me know what you think of the points that I've laid out for you here. Let me know if you disagree and think that it is possible that we can get LaMarcus Aldridge this summer. And if you do disagree, please explain why, but don't explain why with, oh, let's just trade Nasir Little for him. I've gotten into too many arguments over the past couple months with fans that seem to think that matching salary in a trade isn't a thing. I'm sick and tired of hearing people think that we can trade Nasir Little for LaMarcus Aldridge and that's it. I've explained how much salary we'd have to trade out for LaMarcus Aldridge. You can easily Google and look up our team payroll and see what salary we're paying players, and you can add it up. It's not hard to check to see whether or not we can match LaMarcus Aldridge's salary in a trade. So if you do think it's a legitimate possibility, please try and explain why. I'm looking forward to reading your comments. Will I be convinced by any arguments? Probably not. I've done my homework, but if you do disagree, I do want to hear it down below. So anyway, that wraps up this video. Thank you guys for watching. I'll catch you guys later. As always, peace out. Go Blazers.